We spend a week exploring a rich theme of environmental problems and exploring a range of solutions. Our theme this year is Green Innovation in China and the US, Creating Climate Solutions. And I am just excited to explore the range of pollution and climate problems that plague us across the US, across China, across a variety of regions, all regions of the world, and the innovative and exploratory approaches that are being taken that we can learn from our own country, from other countries, and expand and explore new solutions and opportunities. So thank you so much for joining us here. Yesterday, we had our first event. It was a movie screening. So right here on the big screen, we were transported to China and to a number of different industries, into households. Please come in, you're welcome here. To see how individuals, institutions, and governments were approaching the climate change and addressing them on scales from grocery shopping bags to megacity transportation structures. And so I would like to move things right along and introduce our dean of the student body, Bruce Suttmeyer, who has a couple welcoming words for you as well.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. And thanks especially to Jessica Kleiss, who does so much work in putting this event together, along with the co-chairs, Morgane and Kaya, who I'm sure I saw 0.1% of what they did, and still I was tired just seeing all of the work they did putting this together. I encourage you to take advantage of the week of activities, the 2 keynotes, the movies, the panel, the other opportunities to really engage with the speakers that we brought in and the experts. It really is an amazing opportunity. Environmental studies, probably more than any department on campus, does incredible interdisciplinary work, looking across differences, across different disciplines to ask really interesting questions. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the co-chairs and to, I cannot forget, of course, Laura Munt, who makes it all happen. So thank you to all of you. Welcome to Dr. Xu, and welcome to the ENVX Symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Suttmeyer, and thank you all for being here with us tonight. My name is Morgane, and I'm one of the student co-chairs for this year's symposium. Kaya and I have put a lot of time into this, so it's really great to see everyone here. I'm really honored to get to introduce our keynote for tonight, which is Dr. Angel Xu. Dr. Xu is a current professor at UNC Chapel Hill, where she is an associate of public policy, environment, ecology, and energy programs. Dr. Xu's research dives into environmental sustainability issues such as energy, urbanization, air quality, and how public policy interacts with those topics. Dr. Xu is also the founder and active director of the Data-Driven Enviro Lab, which uses quantitative data to face environmental issues. I know you will all see soon the reason why I'm so happy to introduce to you our night's keynote speaker, Angel Xu.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Morgane, for that amazing introduction, and thank you all for being here. I know it was stiff competition with the vice presidential debate with J.D. Vance and Governor Walz, so I'm hoping that I will be able to put on a good show. Anyways, thank you so much for inviting me and welcoming me here to be your speaker at the Environment Across Boundaries Symposium. I'm particularly excited because these types of boundary-crossing, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary conversations are exactly what we need in order to solve the climate crisis. And interdisciplinarity has really been a theme throughout my own career, even from the time way back when I was an undergraduate, just like you, at a liberal arts college. And I guess I have a more detailed background here. At the time, my college experience, we didn't have an interdisciplinary environmental studies major. So I found myself borrowing a conservation class from biology, and then I decided to major in political science. So I was taking classes on comparative politics and institutions. But it wasn't really until my first job at the World Resources Institute, which is an environmental think tank in Washington, D.C., that I really began to understand what interdisciplinarity really meant and its importance for solving really challenging environmental issues like climate change. So I realized that in order to have effective climate solutions, they have to be grounded in data and robust science. And so while working on a project called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which established the global standard for corporations and governments to measure and account for their greenhouse gas emissions, I was sent to China as one of the very first employees to open up the Beijing office. It was the first overseas office right before the Olympics in 2008. And that was an incredible time to be in China, because right before my very eyes, and I think you saw some of this if you went to the movie screening last night, I was witnessing this incredible transformation of a country that was really grappling with incredible economic growth on one hand, but then these incredibly pressing environmental challenges, growing air pollution and water scarcity, growing greenhouse gas emissions, energy crises. But I was also struck at the appetite that my Chinese colleagues and the Chinese government had for data and for more scientific approaches to guide and underpin their climate solutions. And also because at that time, everyone in China thought I was the translator, even though my Chinese was like really terrible at the time. I thought, okay, I have to go back to school and I have to really sharpen not just my Mandarin, but I was lucky enough to be accepted into an interdisciplinary PhD program that allowed me to develop expertise in data science, in GIS and remote sensing, and also policy analysis. And so I feel very fortunate to be able to have this interdisciplinary perspective in all of my work. So I really applaud what you're doing, and wow, it's 27 years of this conference, it's really remarkable. So when I met with the committee to talk about what I would do for the next 45 minutes, there were a lot of ideas that were thrown. So cities and climate change, and we talked about US and China collaboration at the subnational scale. I think Belt and Road Initiative was also thrown in there. And love it or hate it, AI was also introduced as a potential topic for me to cover. So not being somebody who shies away from a challenge, I decided I'm going to try to do all of that in this talk today. And, it could be a crashing disaster because I've never done this before, but I'm hoping that I can give you a flavor of some of the kinds of issues that I see, in particular with respect to the US-China relationship at the subnational scale, and the role that cities in both countries can really play to help break through a lot of the geopolitical tension that has stymied national cooperation between the two countries on the environment and climate change for the last several years. Okay, also, the committee asked me to make this interactive. So if you can pull out your phone and scan this QR code, the first question I want to ask to get our creative juices and our thinking caps going are, what are the biggest challenges that you think cities face in addressing the climate crisis? So this is specific to cities, and just do the word cloud exercise. Don't move on. There are other quiz questions, but I have them sprinkled throughout this presentation. So just take a minute and do this word cloud. Is everyone scanned? Okay, I don't see, okay, I see a couple more phones. So I'm going to pop on over to this, and hopefully it works. Okay. Whoops, this is not working. Oh, there we go. Wow, okay. Probably because we have a panel tomorrow on transportation. So a lot of people are responding transportation, but really interesting responses we see. So the way a word cloud works is the words are sized according to the popularity of the responses and the frequency with which people are entering in these responses. So we're seeing transportation being a central theme, energy. Oh, great, we see some themes around policy and communication, great. And then along the fringes, we see some other responses on vulnerable communities, material resources, extreme weather, heat island effect, excellent. I have some research on the heat island. Okay, but it seems like transportation is pretty central. So I'm not going to talk that much about transportation because we do have other speakers who are going to be covering transportation, but this is a really good start for the conversation this evening. Okay, I'm going to first talk about the role of cities and the climate crisis. And really, I want to highlight the dual role that cities play in terms of being some of the most affected places on the planet when it comes to the climate crisis. But then also, they are drivers of climate change and hold some of the solutions. And I think framing our discussion of cities and climate change in this way provides a powerful lens by which we can explore potential collaboration and break through some of that gridlock between US and China collaboration on the environment and climate change. And so we're currently living in what some call the great acceleration of the Anthropocene. It's a defining period where you can see here on the left, we've experienced a remarkable uptick in the socioeconomic trends, including population growth, an explosion of GDP, foreign direct investment, urban population. All these indicators have led to technological innovation and global connectivity. These are all positive, but they have not come without a cost. And so you can see here on the right, in green, these accompanying and more worrying, environmental trends. So increases in greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, as well as resource depletion and land degradation. And so we can see that even though in this great acceleration we have achieved remarkable, unprecedented human development and progress, it has come at a cost of exacerbating these environmental impacts. And so our planet is now straining under the weight of humanity. And Johan Rockström, who is a really well-known climate scientist, just said last week that the Earth is now surpassing 7 of 9 planetary boundaries. And you can see here, if I can find my cursor, urban population has also been one of these socioeconomic trends, where now more than half of the world's population is living in cities, and that number is expected to increase to about 2/3 by mid-century. And so even though cities occupy less than 2% of global land area, you can see from these statistics from the UN that they're generating huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. I've seen percentages as much as 85%, more than 70% of global waste, and they consume more than 60% of global energy consumption. So really driving a lot of these current trends when it comes to those greenhouse gas emissions and that increase in waste consumption. But to really understand how cities are contributing to climate change, it's important to understand the urban climate cycle. So this is a figure from one of our papers where we review the role of cities in decarbonization. And you can see these gray arrows that are coming up out of the diagram show how human activities, so driving our cars, powering our homes and our factories, generate greenhouse gas emissions. And then these blue arrows, you can see, they help to counteract some of the emissions that are created. So natural processes within cities, absorption from soils and trees and vegetated spaces can help to moderate some of these greenhouse gas emissions that are generated through our human activities. But then you can also see, if you can see my cursor, these purple arrows too. So urban emissions don't necessarily just occur within the urban boundary, they actually expand beyond because we're importing materials and energy and exporting waste, and those also have associated emissions. And then this red dotted line, you can see that also cities have an indirect effect on the climate as well. So they are generating heat and air pollution that also contributes to global climate change. And so if we take a look at these figures from the latest IPCC, has everyone heard of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on, okay, great, I'm seeing some good nods. So this is the global scientific assessment of the climate change literature. And so this figure here illustrates why cities are hotspots of global warming, and that's largely due to the urban heat island effect. So I'm really glad that somebody responded to that in the word cloud. Because it's true, cities tend to be significantly warmer than their rural counterparts, sometimes 3 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than then a background rural reference. And that's due to this dense geometry. You can see city geometry of urban forms that co-locate human activities, such as transport and industry, and through the built environment, concrete and asphalt, that's trapping a lot of warmth that would have been released back into space. And also you can see in these green arrows, these green bars here, that cities often lack natural cooling from water bodies or from vegetation that would help to moderate some of that heat. And so as a result, you can see in this map here, also from the IPCC, that there's been a general increase in surface air temperature from 1950 to 2018. Some of the greatest increases have been seen in cities like Kolkata, Tehran, and Moscow. And so this just illustrates the local effect of urbanization, which is compounding this broader global issue of climate change and global warming. So cities are really contributing to this effect. And unfortunately, it's expected to worsen. So here on the left, this IPCC figure shows the anticipated growth in urban population by mid-century. So I mentioned that half of the world's population is currently living in cities. We're expecting to add another 2.5 billion people to urban areas by 2050. And most of that growth is happening in Asia and also in Africa. And those are already some of the areas in the world that are experiencing some of the greatest increases in temperature. So what's scary about this map here, you can see in purple, these are days per year when air temperature and humidity conditions pose a risk of death. There are much more purple areas, particularly in these mid-latitudes, Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, southern China, as compared to present day or the reference here above. And so it's these compounding trends of urbanization, of more people moving to cities, more cities getting built, and then the location of these cities being predominantly in the global south, including Asia and Africa, that is posing an even greater risk. So it means that more people are going to be exposed to these climate threats in cities in Asia and Africa in the future. And I'd like to highlight this quote from the IPCC from this chapter. So they conclude, the scientists, these are 3,000 scientists that are nominated by governments. I was also lucky to contribute to the third working group on mitigation, so not this one on impacts. But they conclude evidence from rural and urban settlements is unequivocal. Climate impacts are felt disproportionately in urban communities, with the most economically and socially marginalized being the most affected. And that's really due to, as we saw in those previous trends, the growth of urban population predominantly in the global south. And the number of people living in these areas just reinforces the fact that how much climate affects cities really varies depending on the type of settlement and economic resources. So many of these cities are located in coastal regions or in low-lying areas that are particularly vulnerable to not just heat effects and heat stress, but also from ocean impacts. So storm surges and sea level rise also make cities incredibly threatened. In terms of soil erosion, this is also a notable challenge. Also more extreme weather events. I just flew from North Carolina. If anyone's been watching the news, Western North Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, upstate South Carolina, where I was born and raised, completely devastated by Hurricane Helene. A once in a 1,000-year event hit in less than 100 years. And so it's really been very hard, and I think just reminds us of the vulnerability that we all face when it comes to these extreme climate events that are unfortunately becoming more frequent. And then I highlighted this part here because, of course, contributing to the underlying vulnerability of these climate impacts within cities is, of course, inequality. And so this was also a thing that I was asked to cover, but a lot of my work is looking at cities, not just these engines of environmental growth, economic growth, but also sites of inequality. And so this is an image of Los Angeles. Is anyone from LA? Okay, one person, great, or a couple of people. So this is an image from Johnny Miller. He's this incredible photographer that has this Unequal Scenes project. He photographs these images in cities all throughout the world. And so in Los Angeles, I think what really stands out to me are these skyscrapers in the background that are juxtaposed with these more informal encampments along the road. And in our work, so we have an index called the Urban Environment and Social Inclusion Index, where we're using satellite remote sensing data, crowdsourced data, to measure neighborhood by neighborhood how cities are performing on environmental issues like tree cover and climate change emissions and sustainable transit. And you can see Los Angeles, these wealthier neighborhoods in dark green. So I think this is Santa Monica. This is like Inglewood in downtown LA. So the average per capita income of people living in this neighborhood, over $130,000 US per person. People living here only around $30,000 or so US dollars per person. And that translates into disparities in tree cover. So people living here have more than 70% tree cover and shade, and people living here less than 5%. And so, of course, not only are they at a disparity in terms of income and wealth, but also that translates into a higher percentage and higher temperatures and heat island effect that they're exposed to. So you can see the darker areas are much hotter than these cooler neighborhoods here that have more tree cover. And these patterns we have found in our research are not just common to the United States, but they're found all throughout the world. So this is a global map of that same data, and you can see that the circles in red are those where cities are burdening less wealthy populations with a higher percentage of urban heat island exposure compared to their wealthier counterparts. So these patterns are common all throughout the US. In fact, some of our studies have found that in 97% of US cities, populations that are below the poverty line and communities of color are exposed to almost a full degree Celsius on average urban heat. So the extremes can be much higher if you have taken statistics and understand data distributions. And you can see in Europe, all throughout Australia, Southeast Asia, the only part where we actually see patterns be a little bit different and a reverse is actually in China. So does anyone have any hypotheses why in China we would actually see the burden of urban heat placed on wealthier populations compared to less wealthy populations? Anyone have any guesses? You can just shout it.
Less wealthy populations are farmers and outer.
That's right. That's exactly right. So the population, the urbanization dynamics are quite different in China, where you actually have much wealthier people living within cities, and you still have predominantly agrarian and rural communities that have access to greater shade and tree cover. So that's exactly right. I think Beijing has more millionaires than some countries. So now I have my second poll question for you. So this one is an open-ended question. So if you could pull out your phone, or if you still have the survey open, you can go to the second question. So this question is, where do you see the most potential for cities to address the climate crisis? Now we see all the ways in which they're impacted, incredibly vulnerable, and this vulnerability is anticipated to increase, particularly for cities in Asia and Africa. So just take a minute. And hopefully, I'll be able to work the Mentimeter. Ah, wonderful. Okay. Should I try to make it bigger, or should I not test the technology gods? I'll just leave it like, I'll just try to make it as big as I can. Okay, politics and policy. Okay, so these are students after my own heart here, being from a public policy school. The politics with a lot of exclamations. Very true. And we say increasing green spaces, efficiency, clean energy at scale. Certainly there are interconnectivity issues, for sure, particularly for Chinese cities, because a lot of the energy consumption and electricity load centers are located where there are not plentiful renewable energy resources like wind power. Time, development, green infrastructure, banning cars, waste management and water conservation. Seeing a very clear theme of transportation. Oh, there's an interesting comment here. Newly developing and growing cities. Somebody has read the IPCC, I can tell. Because that's exactly one of the findings of the IPCC. Lots in Africa, New Jakarta. Yeah, so they've had to move the capital of Jakarta, or the capital of Indonesia, from Jakarta. They have plans to move it because it's actually sinking. Creative food solutions, excellent. Integration of individuals and businesses. Again, someone after my own heart, because this is a big focus of my own research. Buildings, infrastructure, energy usage, inequality, great. Excellent. Okay, so the responses keep pouring in. Large-scale integrated planning policy. Someone else has read the IPCC. Excellent. Okay, very good. Well, I want to talk about, first of all, how cities can act as climate catalysts, so solutions to addressing climate change along many of the dimensions that you mentioned: transport, planning, motivating citizens to take their own actions, working with businesses, and the idea of multi-level governance. All of these are absolutely correct answers. And there are generally two ways that cities can address climate change. So the first is that they can mitigate their emissions. They can try to reduce their carbon footprint, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions that we saw in the urban carbon cycle. And they can also adapt. They can try to reduce their vulnerability to climate events or growing climate emissions by increasing their resilience. So I have this picture of this house here on stilts. That's a very common adaptive measure. Unfortunately, we're now in a situation, and I think, again, Hurricane Helene really underscores this fact, where cities can no longer choose. It's no longer an either-or situation. It's generally recognized that cities have to do both. They have to mitigate emissions. At the same time, they have to adapt to the fact that the climate is already warming. And so most of my research is focused here on the left side on the role of cities as mitigators of climate change and how can they reduce their own carbon footprint to try to reduce emissions and overall pressure on the climate system. And if we take a look at the IPCC and the goals that scientists have specified are needed in order for us to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change, it's generally thought that we need to contain global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Have you all heard of this goal, the 1.5 degrees Celsius target? Okay, great, a lot of nods. And what that essentially amounts to is that we have to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by mid-century. So that's these scenarios here in this blue. So we have to get to roughly about 50% reductions by 2030, and then we have to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. Beyond that, we have to really tackle those other greenhouse gas emissions, including methane, to get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions beyond that. Unfortunately, these red and yellow lines here signify implemented policies on the part of national governments. So national governments are falling woefully short of where emissions need to go so that we can keep this 1.5 degrees Celsius goal within reach. In fact, if we take all of what the US has done, what China has done, EU, et cetera, that still gets us to about a 2.5 degrees Celsius warming world by 2100. And so that's not great news. But I think what this net zero imperative has done is it has encouraged a lot of different actors, from corporations to national governments to even cities, to think about, well, what can I do and how can I take my own net zero target? So along with some colleagues, we wrote a paper that talked about the idea of net zero cities. Can cities also decarbonize and fully go down to net zero? And what does that really take? And so we really boiled it down to 3 different dimensions. On the supply side, so we think about supply side measures being related to our electricity system. Can we get rid of fossil fuels in how we generate electricity to power and heat our homes and our factories? Can we also electrify mobility? So there's going to be a lot of discussion of EVs in the next panel discussion tomorrow. Can we also capture carbon from when we are combusting some fuels to also remove those from going into the atmosphere? So that's one area of supply side measures. Cities can also enhance carbon uptake within their boundaries. So they can increase the number of trees and green spaces to help act as natural carbon sinks to remove some of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They can lastly, and this is talking about demand side measures, so I think these are often left out of the picture when you think about how do we solve climate change. I think people normally think about supply side measures. They think about cars, electric vehicles, they think about the electric supply grid. I didn't see a lot. I think one person mentioned food in the exercise we just did. But that's really a huge part of the picture as well. And so I was really excited that in the IPCC and the 3rd working group on mitigation, there was a brand new chapter. It's chapter 5. If there's like one chapter that you read in the IPCC, of course I want it to be mine. It's just 4, 8, and 13. But I would actually recommend reading number 5 because it's all about demand side measures. So what can we do as individuals aggregated together to affect the climate crisis? And it's reducing demand. It's doing some of the things that people mentioned in the response. It's trying to integrate spatial planning to reduce the distance between where people live and where they work, or to access other urban amenities. It's improving efficiency in different sectors like the waste sector. It's also working across sectors to increase industrial symbiosis. That's kind of a technical term for just trying to close the loops and trying to be more efficient in reducing waste. And so these are generally the suite of things that we've identified that cities can do to try to decarbonize and become net zero themselves. On the policy side, and so I was so happy to see so many people mention policy and politics and government, because that's exactly what we've been doing for the last 8 or so years. We've been tracking the state of urban climate action. So what are some national governments, cities, states, and regions? What are companies doing on climate change? How are they taking actions to tackle their own carbon footprints? And so working with other organizations, including Utrecht University, New Climate Institute, Oxford, I will say that IKEA also funds this research, and so I feel pretty good about buying all my furniture from IKEA. So they actually fund all of this work. And we're part of this consortia called CAMDA, which is working to enhance the credibility of climate action globally. So we've developed these 6 reports. The latest was released at the COP28 conference, climate conference in Dubai last year, documenting the state of urban climate action and what all these different cities and regional governments are doing to tackle climate change. So there's actually a lot of data science into this, and so some people wanted me to also talk about data science. So the good news is that there are a lot of data science students in my lab, and they spend a lot of time collecting this data using machine learning. And so we've compiled the largest database of subnational climate action globally, detailing what all these different cities all across the world are doing on climate change. The good news is that we can see from this map that more than 13,000 cities are responding to the call for climate action. So this is really exciting because it's also not just, even though we see a huge concentration in Europe, there's also tons of activity happening in Japan and China and Latin America and the Caribbean. In the G20 countries alone, which was the focus of our most recent report, we can see that there are 3,000 cities and 175 regions totaling about 27% of the global population that have pledged their own emission reduction goals. Now, you can see here that in blue, most of these targets are indeed coming from Europe and North America. But if we look at the same picture by population, we actually see that most of the population in cities that have pledged climate action are actually coming from East Asia and the Pacific region. So that's incredibly encouraging because these are major urban centers where they have local governments who are committing to reducing their carbon footprint, to increasing resilience, to develop adaptive strategies, to increase the share of public transit, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, I think, really exciting. And since we've been tracking all of this effort, we have seen an uptick in the number of cities that are engaged and starting to think about how they can tackle the climate crisis. In the US and China, this has been particularly important because, as we know, there are uncertain geopolitical forces and there are election cycles in the United States that could easily reverse national level climate policies. And that's exactly what we saw happen in 2016. With the Trump administration, he ran on the agenda of withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, which is the only globally comprehensive climate treaty on the books. And even just to secure the 25th, so I've been now to 13 climate conferences, and so I understand how arduous and strenuous it is to try to get people to agree, because this is a consensus-based fora, the UN is. And so it was incredibly important for the US and China in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. Presidents Obama and Xi Jinping, they got together in 2014 and then in 2015. And as part of that dialogue, that bilateral dialogue, was the idea of peaking pioneers in both the US and China. The idea that subnational governments, so states in the United States, provinces in China, and cities could actually work together and share best practices and work together to try to reduce their own emissions footprint. And so that was widely considered as being one of the key pieces to getting US and China together, and that really paved the way for other countries like India and Brazil to feel comfortable to agreeing to the Paris Agreement. And so you can see here that on the left, now we have close to 200 cities and regions in the US, almost 3/4 of the population that have made some type of climate commitment. And about 1/3 of those targets are actually those net zero targets. In China, it's not as numerous, but we still have about half of the population in cities and regions that are pledging, and most of those are actually net zero targets. So this is where China's subnational governments are leading. This is a little bit out to date. Now there are currently about 80 cities and provinces that have proposed peaking dates, and some of those are actually earlier than the China national peaking target of 2030. But this picture really shows how many are actually reducing emissions, because of course, with a peak, you can increase emissions and then you can just flatline. So there's no guarantee that you're actually coming down, even though that's really what we need to happen. So in this analysis here, we just incorporated quantifiable emissions reductions. They had to be reducing their emissions. But still, it's quite impressive to see these peaking pioneers. And even Xi Jinping, when he addressed the UN last year, he talked about how we must build our climate change efforts at the national level on the backs of these peaking pioneers within China. So it has stayed, it has endured as being a cornerstone of China's climate change policy since this effort was announced in 2015. And I think there's a lot of reason to have a lot of optimism when it comes to subnational exchange between the two countries. I will say that working on US-China from 2016 to 2020 and even during the pandemic was quite challenging, because even though climate change and environment has traditionally been considered a bright spot in US-China relations, there have been starts and stops, even in the Biden administration when Nancy Pelosi went to visit Taiwan, where the US and China could not collaborate and talk about climate change. And so it's been incredibly important to sustain that momentum at the subnational level. You can see in this picture here, this is former California Governor Jerry Brown. He actually went to China and met with Xi Jinping. This is highly unusual. Governors normally don't meet with heads of state one-to-one. And that's exactly what he did. And he convened this Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco in 2018. They brought a huge Chinese delegation. I was there, it was incredible. They signed more than 20 memorandums of understanding covering zero emissions vehicles, emissions trading, air pollution, clean energy. It was incredibly exciting, and included businesses and other subnational governments outside of California, so that was really great. And then most recently in May, they had a follow-up summit. So the Sunnyland statement last year that involved Xi Jinping and President Biden, they had committed, one of the few areas they could actually agree on was to have more subnational exchange. So they had a follow-up summit in Berkeley in May. This is one of the pictures I took from there, and it was great. Here you have US mayors and governors that are exchanging what they're doing on clean energy and transportation and incentives and all these kinds of things alongside Chinese counterparts. And I think that's incredibly impactful. They agreed to 10 areas of cooperation, including youth exchange, and then also to further discourse on methane and non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And I think what's really important is because the model has always been, oh, well, China should learn from the West, and what can we in the US share with China from our own experience? But I think the tables have really reversed. And so these are a couple of headlines that I picked up. Shenzhen, for example, in southern China, has 16,000 electric buses and 22,000 electric taxis. Like, these numbers are blowing my mind. Hainan, which is the small island off the coast of southern China, has also agreed to ban fossil fuel cars by 2030. Now, a lot of states are talking about that, but I haven't heard of a single state that has actually committed to banning internal combustion engine and at that time, type of aggressive timeline. You also had California Governor Mayor Newsom, who went over to China last year, signed again a bunch of MOUs, was learning about offshore wind. I mean, there's just a lot of innovation that's happening in China that I think now is the time the US can really learn from. And so I think this is a really exciting time to continue these conversations, and it really represents this bellwether amidst a rockier US-China relationship that has frankly led to the United States being able to even show up at a lot of these climate conferences. I mean, in 2016, I remember the climate conference was in Morocco, and the election happened in the middle of it. And I remember talking to US government officials and saying, what now? Because they knew they were all out of jobs, like essentially in a couple of months. And literally, you could feel and see everybody move from the US pavilion to go and to hear what the Chinese were doing. Everyone just immediately, they knew that US leadership on the climate issue was probably not gonna happen. And so everybody was immediately asking the Chinese. I remember asking Chinese colleagues, oh, does this mean that China's gonna take the mantle of climate leadership? And of course they demurred and they said, no, we're still learning, we're still a developing country, we still have much to learn from the West. But I think the tables are really turned. I think we have a lot to learn from Chinese counterparts. And so diving a little bit more deeper into what this all adds up to, because I think that's also a clear question. I showed you that emissions picture. You saw that huge gap that's leading us to this warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So one of the critical questions we ask in this work is, if we added up what all of the Chinese subnationals are doing, does that get us to 2 degrees or even the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal? So the answer is no. So you can see this tiny little red bar. These are the city and region reductions. But I think what's encouraging is that they actually exceed the national government. So if all the Chinese provinces and the cities were to implement their net zero pledges, all of their emission reduction targets, and these are just the ones that we can find evidence of policy, that actually exceeds what the national government in green here, this green little star, has pledged. The US picture is not as promising. You can see here, this is the sum of the US states and cities. So only 19 states in the US have actually pledged a net zero target. So that doesn't really get us to this green dot of what the US itself at the national level has pledged. So really different dynamics in the US and China. That's where I also think that, and I'll talk about this later, where US can really learn from China. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so we'll go to the next poll question. This one's easier. This one's just a multiple choice. So which area do you think cities have the least data to make climate-related decisions? And the reason why I'm asking this is because, of course, everything I just showed you is all based on assumptions. We're assuming that all of these policy actors, all these cities, these states and regions, they actually follow through on what they pledged. And that's a huge assumption because we all know that it's very easy. You have a change in leadership, you can roll back a policy. A mayor says, oh yeah, I will decarbonize by 2050, but then they may not be alive in 2050 to actually see that through. So a critical part of all of this is data, and not just for the cities to track how they're doing, but also for us collectively to understand whether or not they're following through on their commitments. And so I want to know from you, which area do you think cities have the least data to make climate-related decisions? Okay, so now I'm going to go to my Mentimeter and hopefully, great. Okay, so I think I've biased the audience because more people are saying policy. But we're seeing some mentions of risk, which is great, and also nature. These are all very important issues. It seems like, it's interesting because I feel like if I were to ask a business school audience, maybe we would get more responses. Or actually, if you ask the cities themselves, they all say finance. They're all like, we need money. We need money to actually implement these solutions. Okay, great. So let me turn back to my PowerPoint and talk about data. So a very common framework to think about, well, where do cities actually need data to track how they're doing on climate mitigation and adaptation is this DPSIR framework. And this was started by the OECD, and it's a really powerful tool for understanding the complex dynamics of climate change within cities. So driving forces, you can see here, represent the root causes, such as greenhouse gas emissions, or they could be inequality, poverty data for adaptation. And then pressures include spatial data, for example, on mitigation and adaptation, understanding how urban growth and development can stress the environment. State reflects the current conditions, so where data on, for example, the remaining carbon budget can help inform mitigation policy. Adaptation, there can be regional differences and impacts on extreme events. And then, of course, you have impacts. This highlights the results of climate pressures with a focus on the benefits of mitigation efforts and also biodiversity loss that demand adaptive strategies. And then here you've got responses, so mitigation and adaptation. So these are ideally all the different dimensions that cities should be able to get data to track how these different forces are playing out and then how their responses are actually performing and reducing the driving forces or the pressures and the impacts that climate change poses. But let me actually pull up this chapter from the IPCC AR5. This is the first time that there was actually a chapter on cities, on human settlements, infrastructure, and spatial planning. And there's a paragraph here that to me is just so impactful in summarizing some of the challenges that cities face when it comes to data and information. So I don't know, that's probably, oh, you can see it better here. I'm like squinting here. I didn't bring my glasses. So here, lack of consistent and comparable emissions data. Second, little scientific understanding of the magnitude of emissions reductions from urban form. So these are policy-related questions. The accounting is also very inconsistent. There are few evaluations of the effectiveness of policy. So those who answer policy are dead on with what the scientists also concluded. Sixth, there's a large uncertainty about future urbanization trajectories. So huge amounts of data gaps and lack of information and still a lot of just chasms in terms of our understanding of this relationship between cities and what they can actually do to address the climate crisis. In fact, the IPCC now has a special report for cities and climate change. And it's the only special report in this upcoming cycle. So anyone who's working on climate-related research, definitely try to publish it because we need information to help fill some of these gaps. So let me go back to this map that I showed of this. I was so excited. I was cheerleading it. I was pumping it up, saying all these cities are responding to the call for climate action. Now let me show you how many of these cities actually report data. Only that many. So fewer than 10% actually publish emissions inventories for us to be able to evaluate all of those various pressures, the states, the responses, the efficacy, and that's really the problem that we're faced. And so if you're still with me, this is why I question, is there an opportunity for AI? Can we think about advanced techniques, next generation technologies and approaches that can help fill in and address some of these gaps? Because we desperately, as you saw what the IPCC said, we need to know, we need evidence. And now we have this whole special issue on climate change in cities where we're calling specifically for evidence because we need to guide cities in terms of helping them develop the strategies that they know are going to be effective to reduce their climate impacts and reduce their own vulnerabilities. And so AI is now being bandied for being able to do so many different things with respect to climate change and environment, from energy grid optimization for folks who are studying that, or trying to time and better manage the grid to handle renewable energy and better manage base loads and peak load power. Building energy, I'm sure you've heard of smart buildings. If you have a Nest thermostat, for example, that's an example. Precision agriculture, et cetera, traffic control. In fact, most of the studies that relate to machine learning and urban climate mitigation that you can see here are focused on transport and mobility, buildings and consumption. So I think this is really a great opportunity for the panel tomorrow. So people should ask about, okay, well, how is AI being introduced in EVs? And this is exactly what researchers are doing. They're investigating how they can use AI to help determine optimal places to put charging stations and routes that people take, and all these. I'm sure Yuzhou is going to talk about this tomorrow. And in China, what we have seen is that many Chinese provinces are also mentioning some type of big data or large-scale data, technology, or smart approach in their 14th five-year plan. So we did an analysis of more than 40 of these provincial plans, so five-year development plans. What China does at the national level is they develop these blueprints, these social and economic blueprints in five-year chunks to guide the development of the economy and society. And then provinces then, based on that national plan, they then adapt their own five-year plans. And I was really surprised to see that there were so many mentions of the use of technology and smart approaches to help guide some of those socioeconomic decisions. In fact, there was the greatest prevalence of mentions of these technologies in the energy and the tech sectors. So let me give you two examples. One is City Brain Initiative. So these were actually started in 2016 in Hangzhou. I was just there in August and met with some of the researchers at Zhejiang University who are working on City Brain. So it's actually a partnership with Alibaba, which is like the Chinese version of Google, a huge tech company. And so they have developed this cloud technology, and it integrates with sensors, you can see here, all throughout the city to help better manage traffic flow. And they say that it's helped to improve traffic congestion and increase the speed of traffic. I just noticed that this figure that I downloaded from Baidu, the Chinese internet, says City Brain, but it should be City Brain. So City Brain. Now more than 20 cities across China has adopted these City Brain initiatives, and now Alibaba has expanded. Now there's like environmental cloud, and there's pandemic response brain initiatives. So there's a lot of different of these initiatives all trying to integrate smart approaches and increasing the amount of data to try to monitor phenomenon in real time to create solutions. So this is one example. Another example that I've written about in my own research is engaging citizens. I think this is a really interesting model of how the Chinese government has engaged citizens and information communication technologies. Anyone on WeChat? So WeChat is like just a far superior app compared to WhatsApp or Messenger, or I'm not on TikTok, but I'm assuming it's better than TikTok. So WeChat, I mean, you basically cannot do anything in China if you don't have WeChat. And so what they did is they integrated this black and smelly waters app so that citizens going throughout cities, if they come across a polluted water body, they can then report on the water body and the trash that's floating. You can say how polluted that water body is, there any trash floating in there, and then they send a message through the WeChat app that then notifies a local government official, and they then have 7 days to then respond, check it out, and then tell you how they address that particular pollution incident. And so what we found is that this is chemical oxygen demand. This is an indicator of water pollution. They actually decreased 36%, so about a third, 5 and 6 months after a citizen complaint was made from this Black and Smelly Waters app. So really a very interesting and unique and innovative way of using technology and engaging citizens to care about the environment. The last example, and I think this is like probably one of the most controversial that I'm enmeshed in right now, but is large language models and generative AI. So how many of you have used ChatGPT? I won't tell your professors. But yeah, I use it every day, so I'm gonna raise both hands because it's almost ubiquitous. It's so hard not to be confronted with generative AI and these large language models. And so now there are climate change specific large language models that are emerging to help guide policy, to make it easier to try to sift through thousands of pages of documents. And I mean, for anyone who is in a social science and you've ever used the ENVX software and you've done a lot of coding and a lot of manual inspection of documents, I mean, this type of technology really provides a lot of potential to do that at scale and much faster, but of course with a lot of concerns and limitations. So, and shameless plug, this ChatNet Zero is actually our large language model chatbot, and we designed it specifically because we are concerned about the hallucination problem with respect to generic LLMs. And the fact that you have no idea how these responses are being generated, you don't know what data is being fed to then generate those responses, so there could be a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's propagated. But I think that this is one area where we see a technology that could really help us scale the speed of solutions that we need to try to bring those emissions back down. Okay, so the last poll question, now that I've sufficiently either excited you or terrified you when it comes to technology and AI, what do you consider the biggest risk associated with using AI to manage climate and environmental actions in cities? This is another open-ended one, and this is the last poll question. So I will pop again to my Mentimeter and see what you say. Yes, AI still very new, misinformation, wrong answers, hyper-surveillance, AI is still unreliable, racism, yes, we'll definitely talk about that. Environmental impact, yes, we'll talk about that, of LLM upkeep. Data errors, yes, a lot of misinformation. Garbage in, garbage out, exactly, definitely gonna talk about that. AI doesn't have common sense or human reasoning skills. That is true, although it can really mimic pretty closely, I think, human language, and so I think that's what makes us feel like it perhaps could, and I think that's also quite dangerous. Humans get so many wrong answers, how can AI consider all the factors that humans might exactly? So limitations, so yeah, these are all issues that I think we need to be asking, and all questions we need to be asking of this technology. And I was just sharing with Kaya and Morgane that I was in Climate Week in New York last week, and it's all filled with these people who are trying to peddle their new Gen AI apps. And there are all these engineers and computer scientists that are saying, oh, AI is gonna be able to characterize all your climate risk with the touch of a button. And then you quickly realize that they're not appropriately evaluating these models, and they're not appropriately benchmarking them. So I think there's certainly a lot of challenges. But I want to first just take a step back and talk about the challenges and opportunities for collaboration between the US and China in this new space of technology and data and at the city scale. So exactly as some people say, what I think in terms of adopting these database and AI approaches, we're going to see, and we have already seen, increased energy demand, and that could actually slow climate progress. So here on this right hand, you see figure 1, estimated energy consumption per request for various AI-powered systems compared to a standard Google search. So I actually was giving a talk at Lenovo a couple weeks ago, and there was somebody on the panel from Duke Energy who said, one Google search can power a light bulb for about 20 seconds. One ChatGPT search can power it for 3 minutes. That is, I think, the most clear explanation of the impacts of Gen AI in terms of energy demand. Greenpeace China also did this report a couple years ago where they looked at the increase in terms of energy demand from 5G technologies and from data centers. A nearly 500% increase, and these numbers were from 2021, so I imagine it's already through the roof. And then same thing, 222% increase for data centers. And that's only expected to grow. A couple years ago, and China has still not recovered from this, but due to climate change, actually a lot of pressure in terms of droughts and high temperatures, and also the increase in energy demand, that led to a real power crunch in China. So you can see in this map here, all of these provinces that had to actually ration electricity. They were facing huge electricity crises and had to shut down a lot of factories, and that actually led them to go and mine more coal. So they had closed a bunch of coal mines because of their climate commitments and their goal to carbon neutrality by 2060. They actually had to go back and reopen some of the coal mines they shuttered and import coal from Southeast Asia, from Australia, from Central Asia. And so that really led people to question, well, is China really credible in their climate actions? So then the New York Times asked me to write this op-ed. So I talked about how the fact that it's like a ship, it's like a big ship that takes a while to turn. But also, I mean, I think it's fair to ask these questions. And what does this actually mean? Because coal consumption has continued to increase in China. It has not reached a peak yet. And that really can threaten China's ability to actually meet its climate neutrality target because, of course, coal is still about 60% of China's overall energy mix, and it's incredibly carbon intensive. So that's one challenge that I think there's lots of opportunity for US and China to try to work together on because both want to be AI powerhouses. And even in the state of North Carolina, Lenovo is already talking about housing and building all these data centers that are certainly going to further constrain and strain the energy and the electricity grid. The second, and some people talked about this, I think algorithmic redlining. This is a concept that I recently learned. So the idea that through AI-led decision-making, we could unintentionally be re-entrenching inequalities and allocating resources to some communities over others that just further entrench bias and discrimination, and somebody said racism. So I'm completely in line and in agreement with those criticisms because there's a lot of bias and black box that's inherent with machine learning. So the availability of underlying training data can bias models. Gaps in underdeveloped regions and representativeness can then further bias these models. And I think it's pretty scary to think that decision makers and policymakers could then take those outputs and use them to blindly make decisions. So I think that's also really challenging. And then I think the transparency and trust issue is also really inherent. If you don't know what's going into these models, how can you foster the needed trust to be able to use the data and to guide decisions? So I think this is another challenge. And I'm rushing a little bit because I want to hear your questions as well. I think another area where US and China could really learn from each other is how to navigate the various and often conflicting jurisdictions and governance levels and what we refer to in the literature as power signatures. So in the United States, cities often say that they actually cannot implement climate strategies because they don't have ownership or control over those emission sources. So Chapel Hill's tiny little town, if Chapel Hill sets a carbon neutrality target, they've got to work with the utility company that's not based in Chapel Hill, but we import energy and electricity from them. And so a lot of these power sources, like energy, a city may not actually have control over. And that's where I think China could be particularly insightful in helping to share some of the lessons. So this was a paper that we did a while ago where we looked at the fact that you have Chinese cities like Shenzhen here that are much more vertically integrated with the Chinese national government and able to then better allocate resources in theory and more efficiently implement and test various climate change policies. Whereas you have California all the way down here that's not very vertically integrated, that acts more of like an independent actor within a larger federal system, and it sometimes can be more challenging. We saw that during the Trump administration where California's stricter emission standards for vehicles were challenged in the Supreme Court, and it was declared that they were not allowed to set these standards that actually exceeded the national level. And then lastly, somebody also mentioned this, addressing carbon lock-in. So the fact that established cities in urban form can really hamper the range of emissions reductions options that cities can have. So obviously, if you have more compact urban forms, those can be more efficient. And you can then, once you have that density, you can then implement transportation measures like public transit, electric vehicles, charging stations, and that kind of infrastructure. And it might be easier to decarbonize the electric system and close these supply chain loops. And then so I think that's also another area where US and China could really learn from each other and cooperate because we both have a mix of both established and emerging cities in both contexts. So I did it. I covered all of the different topics the committee wanted me to. I don't know how coherent that was, and I really rushed at the end, but I'm going to stick around at the reception, so I'm really happy to answer your questions then. Or do we have time, Jessica? Okay, so we do. I wasn't sure what time we were going until, so. Okay.
Here, I'm going to grab this too.
Yes, please.
Hello, hello, hello. Great. That was incredible, Angel. Thank you so much. Let's do that one more time.
Never been done. Probably will never be done again. That was exhausting. Trying to cover so many topics in one talk.
And we definitely do have time for questions. Do we have any questions from the audience to get us started? Well, I've got one while everybody's putting their thoughts together. Sometimes it takes a minute to
100%.
to let it steep
And I
in.
speak very fast, so it's just like, you're probably like, what just hit me?
I think my question is actually about the opportunities of government structure. We think a lot in terms of policy. I've heard people say top-down policy
Yes.
or bottom-up policy. And I feel like the differences in what a nation can accomplish, top-down or bottom-up, would differ between China and the US.
That's right.
And I like how you spoke about what we can learn from China. Do you see any opportunities for policy approaches that we haven't thought of yet that we might be able to rub elbows with approaches in China that might actually work here or give us any kind of insight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely the idea. And what I think China has done much better, and I think that's just by nature of their governance system, which if you studied Chinese politics or Chinese governance, is this Qiao Qiao Kuai Kuai system where you have this vertical integration, you have the National Development and Reform Commission, and then you've got provincial level development and reform commissions, you have municipal level development and reform commissions, and they all align and report to each other. So I think that that certainly is a model that in theory, so I keep saying in theory because I will not say that Chinese governance models are perfect and that we can exactly replicate them and that they're able to be much more effective. I mean, because there's still a lot of challenges. You know, there's a saying in Chinese, 山高皇帝远, when the mountains are high, the emperor is far away. And that's exactly what we see happening in China, where you have conversations in Beijing and top-level government officials making these directives, and then the implementation can be very shaky or very weak the farther you get from Beijing. And that's exactly what I found in my own dissertation research. But I do think that there is at least a vertical alignment where when you have that national level signal, it makes it much easier then for the provinces and the cities to then have the directive to say, okay, well, now we have the directive, and so we can do this. And that's like literally the challenge in the US context. Like during the Trump administration, if they're with a rollback of 100 different environmental and climate regulations, states were really hampered by what they could do. I mean, they could try, but then that could end up in the courts and be a very messy battle. And so I think that that just shows the importance of national leadership and national regulation on an issue. So in the governance literature, we talk about this conveyor belt or these virtuous cycles and these loops, and that's what the entire Paris Agreement is predicated on. The fact that you can have subnational governments or companies that take ambitious climate action, that catalyzes more ambitious action, the level up, and then that then spirals up to the very national level and then reinforces or inspires the national government to take even more ambitious or more bold actions on climate change. So I think that's I think a very important lesson that we can learn from China is when you have that top level signal, then you have then the directive and the ability to then align subnational policies. But if you don't have that, then it becomes much harder and much more piecemeal. And so, I mean, that's like part of what we have been doing at the lab is just trying to understand in aggregate, what does that all mean? Does it all add up? How can we make it comparable? And I think what we've seen, particularly in the US context, and is that a lot of states and cities, and the cities within the states don't know what each other is doing. They don't know, okay, well, what target have you set? And does that actually like help us in terms of reaching 1.5? Or are there conflicts there? Are there tensions? Are there trade-offs that we really need to work through? And I think at least in the Chinese system, the idea is that those channels are a lot clearer and the processes are a lot more aligned. And so in theory, again, theory, but you know, 山高皇帝远. So you know, that's also a challenge. Yes, it works.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I thought it was really comprehensive and great. I just wanted to ask a question. I graduated from Lewis and Clark as an environmental studies degree, with an environmental studies degree last year. And I know that when I was here and we were having conversations about green energy, nuclear energy came up a lot.
Oh,
and I don't really have like a specific question, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts or opinions on innovations or policies to do with the implementation of green or nuclear energy, because I know it's kind of like an up and coming idea, and some argue like kind of, controversial. So I'm
Well, it's
curious
absolutely controversial. You're absolutely right. I don't think it's up and coming. It's been around for quite a while. But you're absolutely right. And all of the emission scenarios, the IPCC, all the climate scenarios that show what we need to reduce emissions by, they all assume nuclear energy. So that is a really important assumption. The International Energy Agency, which is one of the leading groups that is doing a lot of this modeling, absolutely assumes that nuclear energy is going to increase in terms of the overall energy mix. China, too, also has aggressive targets for increasing nuclear. That's probably the one area where they haven't been meeting their targets, and it's because of the Fukushima Daiichi incident in 2011 that really caused them to take a pause and rethink their aggressive nuclear targets. But they are absolutely implementing nuclear energy and increasing the share of nuclear energy as part of their overall electricity mix in order to meet their climate goals. So that's it, because it's carbon-free, it's emissions-free, it's air pollution-free. So that's certainly part of that. And China, too, is now experimenting and designing and innovating smaller nuclear reactors as well that can potentially be used in places like Singapore, where I lived for 5 years, where it's a very, very small island. And so the risk of a nuclear disaster could just essentially wipe out the entire country, which is like a city-state. So yeah, I think, but then there are some countries like Taiwan, where my parents are from, where they had a change in leadership, and they said, we are decommissioning the nuclear power plant and we're not going to recommission it. And they've had to revert back to coal and fossil fuels in order to meet their electricity demand. So I think it is really challenging because, as you mentioned, societally, there are some challenges. And so that's exactly why we need to involve social scientists who understand behavior and communication and policy to also be part of the conversation. So how do we think about the range of options that are societally acceptable? Because we need people on board. And I think the latest IPCC really showed that with that Chapter 5 on demand. Is the supply side is only half the answer. We have to really also think about the demand side, and then also the role that individuals have to play in order for us to address climate change. But yeah, great question.
Hi, my name is Kimani Johnson. I have a sister who goes to UNC, so she thought it was pretty cool that you're here
great.
today. My question was regarding how, I believe it was called WeChat, how you can take a picture and tell them that there's pollution. I was wondering, because there are many mixed feelings about social media in America, about how some people use TikTok and some people believe it's a Chinese implant. I was wondering if we had like something similar to WeChat where we took a picture of pollution, would you think it would be popular here, and would it be successful in mitigating pollution and climate change here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, you tell me. I feel like you all are probably more social media savvy. I mean, we were all having a debate before this of how to appropriately take a selfie. So I feel like my generation, I don't know, but how many of you think you would use an app like Black and Smelly Waters to report pollution? Okay, so, well, but this is also like a very active, like clearly you guys are above average in this room. So yeah, I mean, what's really interesting, and a lot of the citizen science research has shown that normally it's like more educated, it's urban, it's wealthier people that tend to participate in citizen science activities for a lot of the reasons that you probably imagine, where people who live in cities are probably have access to greater information, they're more likely to have a smartphone, they're probably more exposed to different media where they're talking about pollution, because part of the challenge in China is that a lot of people living in rural areas were like, oh, well, what is the point of this? And how do we know pollution if we see it? And how do we know this is not just like, oh, because it didn't rain? You know, like there were a lot of these types of issues. And so in our own research and in the papers we wrote about this app, we did see that there was definitely an inherent urban bias. And so I think that, again, just reinforces some of the challenge with technology or even AI-based approaches, is that you may be unintentionally excluding some some of the people that are the most vulnerable and the most affected by water pollution. And so I think there are certainly challenges. I mean, I've been thinking about this question a lot in my own work. So we have another study where we're looking at the heat island effect, and I was working with some colleagues in Singapore to design a smart watch app that asks people about their thermal comfort, because we know that like my perception of what's hot is probably very different from many of you. I feel like my thermostat is always set on like 78, and probably a lot of you be like, oh my God, that is so unbelievably hot. I hate air conditioning, I love humidity, but some people might find that very uncomfortable. And so we all have different interpretations of what thermal comfort is. And so thinking about how to use like a smart watch app in order to gauge that kind of information, but then also realizing not everybody has a smartwatch. And so how do you get information from people that are the most affected, that during an extreme heat event are probably not likely to be able to know where to access information or to recognize the signs of heat stress. And so yeah, there's a lot of, I think, challenges with some of these technology-enabled approaches. And so that's why I get so frustrated in all these conversations with tech people, because they all say, oh, well, we have this app and we have this solution and this technology, and they often just raise like millions of dollars to create these things. They don't think about, okay, is this actually solving the problem that we're trying to answer, and who are we excluding in these modes of data collection and these modes of addressing a problem? So yeah, I don't know, but if you want to work on this, I feel like this would be a great project to like come up with our own black. Maybe we need to work on the branding. Maybe black and smelly waters is not the, but that's what it is in Chinese, hey choha. So. It is not. Oh, it's on now. It's on now. Great.
I can talk loud.
Okay.
I really appreciate your dedication to interdisciplinary studies. And on the topic of navigating power signatures, with China's increasing interest in the development of cities within Africa and the amount of money that they're pouring into these cities, is there any sort of environmental caveat attached to this money? Are they requiring some of the same standards in their own cities as they are when they're putting this money into growing cities in Africa?
That is an unbelievably important question. And when China first announced its carbon neutrality target in 2021, or 2020, it initially did not say anything about overseas investments. So that was a huge, huge question and a huge oversight, because China, if you look at the numbers, and I have like a whole other slide deck based on that, but if you take a look at the numbers and what they're investing in, particularly in Southeast Asia, is a lot of coal-fired and fossil fuel assets. And so a lot of people at the time were questioning, well, how could they claim a carbon neutrality? Because you just saw the urban carbon cycle, right? Where we see that the imported and the exported emissions, those all count as part of an urban footprint. So there were a lot of questions being asked. And so then China in 2021 said, okay, we're going to clarify, we actually are not going to invest in these fossil-fired assets overseas, particularly in the energy infrastructure space, which was one of the biggest sectors in which they were investing in. In Africa, a lot of the energy infrastructure is actually in hydropower, but at least in Southeast Asia, it was a lot of electricity generation and fossil-fired electricity. So at least from the numbers that I've analyzed, they actually have stopped that. So they did have some projects that were in the pipeline, but then they have not committed to building, and that's at least from the public finance piece. So there could be also private developers that are doing their own thing. And so I think part of the challenge also is Southeast Asia, in a lot of those countries, they've also been demanding and asking for fossil-fired infrastructure because they believe that it's cheaper and more stable than a lot of these intermittency issues with some renewable energy sources like solar and wind. So we're now seeing a shift. So globally, more solar and wind has been installed globally and is now cheaper. So that was another thing we emphasized in the IPCC. It's now much, much cheaper to build a power plant using wind and solar, and they've established those numbers also in China. So I think we're seeing certainly a tipping point and a shift in the overall economics. So it's no longer, I think, a argument to say, oh, it's not economically viable to build a power plant that's powered by solar and wind, because that's simply not true. And we show in the IPCC that it's not. But yeah, that is a major question. At least China, they said, now they don't necessarily have caveats to the financing to say, oh, you have to set your own net zero target or you have to set your own emission reduction target. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of countries who are recipients of Chinese aid are so open to it, because it has fewer strings attached than Western aid or aid coming from the United States. And so it's been really interesting. I've been working with an undergraduate student trying to pull a lot of the Chinese investment and US investment numbers in Southeast Asia. China has just outspent every other country, including the US, in terms of foreign direct investment in Southeast Asia. It's just incredible. Because at first I thought, oh, well, maybe I can think of an argument of green finance and US could compete with China in that domain. And I looked at the numbers and it's just like, no way. I mean, even in Thailand, there was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that was talking about how Chinese EV manufacturers have completely taken over like Thai's own auto manufacturing sector. And so BYD and all these other Chinese EVs are just have completely flooded the market. And now the Thais, they can't even compete with their own domestic industries. And a lot of countries are wanting to adopt industrial policies similar to China to tackle climate change. And I mean, they're simply not able to compete with China because they were so open to all this Chinese investment. But yeah, that's a really great question. Probably a much longer response than you brought. But I could keep talking about that in particular.
Hello, there it is. It always takes a minute. That is wonderful. Thank you. You managed to answer the questions directly and succinctly in a way that our vice presidents tonight really did not.
Yes.
So,
all right.
If only our national leadership could mimic your style, I would be so pleased. Let us take our conversation out into the lobby. There are some delicious treats for you to encourage you to stay, talk with each other. Angel will, don't pack up quite yet. Angel will continue to be there, and you can engage her with your questions that you didn't get a chance to answer. Let me also tantalize you with upcoming opportunities to continue this conversation. Tomorrow at 7 o'clock in this very room, we will have a panel discussion about the transition to electric vehicles with an amazing interdisciplinary panel that includes a technician, a government agency worker, the director of ODOT, an economist, and a social environmental perspective. So please come for this wide range of different perspectives about the transition of transportation between China and the United States and the opportunities and challenges therein. Then, same room, 7 o'clock the next day, which is Thursday, we have our second keynote event, which will be focused on the growth in China and both the opportunities and challenges of that Anthropocene, all of those rapid growths in terms of economic, politics, population, consumption, and waste production, and the upsides and downsides of a nation learning to grow and flex its international muscles. And then, on Friday, more than all the rest of our events, we want to warmly invite you upstairs in STAM, this time from 5 to 6:30. Our closing reception. You've had a lot of chance to sit and listen. Friday is going to be your chance to integrate and discuss. It will be an interactive event where if you came to this event, you can show up on Friday. In fact, if you didn't come to this event, you can show up on Friday, tell your friends. We do ask that you RSVP, and we've got some incentives with some prizes to encourage you to talk to people maybe from a different generation or people you don't know. We'll make it gentle and easy to get you out of your shell to discuss some of the themes that have appeared this week. This is a student-designed symposium, and this is how they wanted to encourage you to engage with these ideas and engage with our community, to network and imagine the solutions that we might be able to create both today and in the future. Please enjoy our treats, please enjoy our conversations, and thank you so much.
How do I become a student here? That sounds amazing.